What if the system isn't broken? What if it's functioning exactly the way people running it intended? Because across Washington state and beyond, we keep seeing the same pattern. Violent offenders treated with sympathy, taxpayers treated like ATMs, judges acting like social activists, massive failures hidden behind layers of bureaucratic language and media spin. And somehow most people never see the full picture. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because the system survives in the dark. Tonight we're talking about the activist culture reshaping the courts, why complexity protects power, and why 2026 could become one of the most important judicial elections Washington state has seen in years.
From Seattle to Los Angeles, this is Left Coast News. No apologies, just the truth.
Welcome back to Left Coast News. One of the biggest misconceptions in modern politics is the idea that public institutions drift into dysfunction accidentally. After years of covering Washington state budgets, criminal justice policy, transportation overruns, court filings, and agency scandals, I don't think that explanation holds up anymore. Because when you really start digging into the details, you notice something. The confusion itself has become part of the system. Complexity protects the bureaucracy. Media framing protects the ideology. And public exhaustion protects the people making the decisions. Most people are too busy surviving inflation, rent hikes, taxes, crime, and daily life to spend hours reading judicial opinions or budget audits. The activist machine counts on that. And tonight we're going to connect the dots between media narratives, activist judging, public apathy, and why the people running these institutions desperately need voters to stay disengaged. The apology heard round the district. We start tonight with a moment from the federal bench that should stop every law-abiding citizen in their tracks. Magistrate Judge Zia Faruqui recently looked at Cole Allen, a man accused of driving across the country with a shotgun and manifesto allegedly targeting a political event, and he didn't just issue a legal ruling, he offered an apology. According to reporting on the hearing, Faruqui said he was fascinated and disturbed by Allen's treatment in jail, specifically the use of 5-point restraints. Now, prosecutors argued Allen himself admitted he did not expect to survive the attack he allegedly planned. That is the definition of a high-risk detainee. But instead of focusing primarily on public safety concerns, the hearing reportedly veered into comparisons with January 6 defendants and broader commentary about detention conditions. And this is where a lot of Americans start asking a serious question. When did parts of the judiciary stop acting like neutral referees and start sounding like political commentators? Because to ordinary citizens watching from the outside, it increasingly feels like the system shows more emotional concern for offenders than the communities placed at risk. The system runs on distraction. Now, here's the important part. If you think this is isolated to Washington, D.C., you haven't been paying attention to what's happening on the West Coast or all across the country. In Washington state, this philosophy has become deeply embedded inside parts of the criminal justice system. We constantly hear language about restorative justice, decarceration, and systematic harm. Meanwhile, repeat offenders cycle through the courts faster than taxpayers can keep track of the case numbers. Public frustration grows while officials insist everything is improving. And the average citizen, they rarely have time to investigate beyond the headline. That's critical to understanding how the system sustains itself, because modern bureaucratic power depends heavily on distraction. Most people are working overtime, raising families, paying increasingly absurd utility bills, or trying to survive another round of inflation. They do not have the 3 hours to sit through county budget hearings or dig through sentencing data. So narratives become reality. The media says a judge was compassionate. The press release says a failed program was an equity investment. The agency says the project delay was due to unexpected challenges. And unless someone digs through the underlying documents, the official version becomes the accepted version. The media filter and the complexity trap. Local media still acts as the primary filter between government institutions and the public, and wording matters. One headline says, "Judge prioritizes rehabilitation." Another headline could say, "Repeat offender released despite violent criminal history." Same outcome, completely different emotional framing. Over time, that framing changes how the public interprets accountability itself. Meanwhile, the real details get buried under layers of technical language, legal jargon, spreadsheets, and committee meetings nobody watches. This is something I've been repeatedly covering: sound transit overruns, homeless spending, state transportation audits, and criminal justice reforms. The truth usually is not hidden, it's buried. Buried under complexity, buried under bureaucracy, and buried inside systems so dense the average taxpayer simply gives up trying to follow them. And honestly, that complexity has become a shield. Confused citizens are passive citizens. Passive citizens are easier to govern. Now let's be very clear about something. This isn't just a Washington state problem anymore. What we're watching is a broader ideological shift happening all across the left coast. Washington, Oregon, California, different governments, different cities, same philosophy. Reduce accountability. Reframe criminal behavior as social injustice. Expand bureaucracy. Punish criticism. And then gaslight the public when the results get worse. In Oregon, we watched the fallout from Measure 110, where hard drug possession was effectively decriminalized under the promise that treatment infrastructure would replace enforcement. Instead, Portland became a national symbol of open-air drug use. Overdose deaths surged, businesses fled downtown corridors, and even state leaders eventually admitted the policy had become politically radioactive. The same people who sold the policy as compassion suddenly started scrambling to partially reverse course after the damage became impossible to hide. In California, look at the high-speed rail disaster. Sold to voters as a modern infrastructure revolution, costs exploded. Deadlines collapsed. Segments remain unfinished after years of promises and billions spent. Meanwhile, ordinary Californians are dealing with rising utility costs, insurance pullouts, housing crises, and worsening public disorder, while political leadership continues pitching more mega projects and more spending. Or take Los Angeles and San Francisco, where aggressive decarceration policies collided with retail theft explosions, public drug use, and collapsing confidence in basic law enforcement. Suddenly, major retailers started locking everything behind glass like civilization had entered its raccoon era. Toothpaste behind plexiglass, shampoo under armed guard. Humanity really reached a point where buying deodorant feels like visiting a minimum security bank vault. And across all three states, the pattern stays remarkably consistent. When policies fail, the answer is almost never accountability. The answer is more funding, more task forces, more consultants, more commissions, more messaging campaigns explaining why the public's frustration is the real problem. That's why the people across the West Coast increasingly feel like they're being governed by institutions more concerned with ideological signaling than operational competence. Because in too many cases, they are. And this is where the media filters matter again. The public is often told these are isolated problems. A transportation issue here, a homeless issue there, a prosecution controversy somewhere else. But when you zoom out, the same worldview keeps showing up behind all of it. Skepticism toward enforcement, skepticism toward punishment, skepticism toward traditional public order, but endless faith in bureaucracy and activist governance. That's not random anymore. That's institutional culture. And if voters don't start recognizing that broader pattern, these systems are going to keep replicating themselves all across the region. And if you're watching this from somewhere other than the left coast, you know this is a problem all across the United States, especially in blue states and other Western countries. The ballot box blind spot. This brings us to the political reality the activist machine quietly depends on: voter disengagement. In 2026, 5 of the 9 seats of the Washington State Supreme Court are up for election. This is a majority of the highest court in the state. These justices shape decisions involving police pursuits, criminal sentencing standards, regulatory power, taxation disputes, and the boundaries of state authority itself. They can decide if citizens can challenge state laws. But here's the catch. Judicial races in Washington are officially nonpartisan. When voters open their ballots, they will not see party labels next to these names. No giant ideological warning signs. No simple red versus blue shortcut. And historically, many voters skip judicial races entirely because they do not recognize the names or understand the stakes. The system effectively relies on public unfamiliarity. Most media coverage of judicial races is minimal. Most campaign messaging is vague. Meanwhile, organized activist groups absolutely do pay attention to these elections. They understand that long-term institutional power often flows through the courts, not just the legislature. Waking up the silent majority. If citizens are frustrated with rising crime, inconsistent accountability, or activist judicial philosophy, then judicial elections matter whether people realize it or not. That means learning the names, learning judicial records, learning who appointed whom, learning how candidates describe the role of the courts themselves. Because while most voters focus almost entirely on presidential or gubernatorial races, institutional culture is often shaped quietly through lower profile positions the public barely notices. And that gets to the deeper issue here. The activist machine is organized. It votes consistently. It studies these races. Meanwhile, a huge portion of the public remains politically disengaged until consequences become unavoidable. Crime in the neighborhood, businesses closing, taxes rising, public disorder becoming normalized, or trust in institutions collapsing altogether. By then, the culture inside those institutions is already deeply embedded. Judges mentor judges. Bureaucrats hire bureaucrats. Activist frameworks become standard operating procedure. And changing course becomes exponentially harder. If you are fed up with a pathetic justice system that apologizes to suspects while ignoring victims, you cannot afford to stay in the dark. You have to know the names. You have to know that names like Dave Larson or David Stevens represent a shift toward accountability, while the incumbents and appointees like Sal Munguia and Theo Angelis are the hand-picked favorites of the current activist establishment. Conservative turnout in this state has been crap in the past. If that holds true in 2026, don't be surprised when the next judge apologizes to the next person who threatens your community. The activist machine is awake. They are voting. The question is, are you? The people running these systems do not fear outrage nearly as much as they fear clarity, because clarity creates scrutiny. Scrutiny creates accountability. And accountability threatens systems built on public confusion and emotional framing. The reality is this: darkness is not just a side effect of the system anymore. In many ways, it has become part of the architecture. But voters still have power if they are willing to pay attention long enough to use it. The question heading into 2026 is whether enough people are finally waking up before the next round of decisions gets locked into place. Thank you for watching Left Coast News. Please like, share, and follow us if you got anything out of this story. You can find us on Rumble, YouTube, Brighteon, BitChute, Spotify, X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Patreon, and Truth Social. And drop a comment below. Do you think judicial races get ignored intentionally, or are most voters simply too overwhelmed to follow them? Let's make a difference in the upcoming election. Educate yourself. Vote.